Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. We're talking about um, the state of things. Okay, now we were just talking about sort of the looking at the military and sort of American empire when it comes to building military bases around the world and sort of the influence and justifying war and all of those different things. So, how do we explore things like the military, just as an entity into itself? How do we experience? How do we study things like this? So, what impact does the military have on civilian populations? Well, we know that there are certainly economic and cultural influences. If we think about the bases around the world and certainly at home, right? A lot of those bases have economic influence, right? They provide a significant portion of a local community's economy because they're spending their money there. Um, there can be cultural influence. Again, sort of the justification for having a military becomes more and more appropriate. At the same time, you can find more resistance in some of those communities when you've got a large population or you've got a large military presence, right? Again, it depends on sort of your situation. If we go to back to that example of like Okinawa, Japan, well, there's been this huge push from the local population to have the military base disbanded and moved away for lots of different reasons. Um, there have been for years difficulties between the military base there and the local population, especially when you've got rowdy soldiers that can cause trouble within that community. And then just the influence and impact that that military base has on the local population isn't always seen as a positive, right? There are usually some good economic bonuses, but at the same time, that economic bonus might not be worth the justification, depending on that community. So it all depends on sort of like where that military is based and who that civilian population looks like, right? Whether or not it's a different culture in a different country or whether or not it's local, um, right? You're going to have two different circumstances. Uh, what is the popular view of the military? Interesting fact that if you are, let's say you're in Hollywood and you want to make a film that includes the military will oftentimes fund some of those movie projects. Um, but if you want to use anything about the military and receive that kind of funding, you cannot show the military in a negative light. You can only do it in a positive light. Okay. And that's cultural influence that the military has over places like Hollywood, right? Think about the last time that you saw a movie in which the military was portrayed in a negative way, and truly in a negative way, not necessarily individuals, right? There are plenty of examples in which individuals were seen negatively, but always the military is portrayed in a positive sense. So, right, we see that the general population believes that the military is a necessary thing, that we have to have it, that it is a benefit to our society. Um, and so we can then idealize and justify having one and spending the resources on that military. How does the military create their own image? Well, we talked a little bit about like their portrayal in movies. They also create their own sort of games. I remember a number of years ago, it was like what was it called, like Army of One or Army of Two, something like that. They came out with a game similar in style to like Call of Duty, but it was designed and then put out there from the U.S. military, right? And it was sort of like a recruitment game, and the game did all right. Um, but it was done in a way that, again, was trying to get a particular message out, trying to attract a certain type of person that might be interested in joining the military. Um, and when we think about advertisements and what the benefits of joining the military can be, learning discipline and um, becoming part of a community and learning life skills and getting trained in different ways. All of that is a reality. Not all of it is a practical reality. Um, so again, it might depend on what kind of access you're going to get to those resources. And we also understand that um, when we think about, like, say, like veterans, right? How do veterans view the military? Um, and that's a complicated question because a lot of veterans value their time, value the companionship um, that they experience within the military. If they are veterans of war, then there can also be things like trauma and disease and injuries, and of course that's not going to have a positive impact. But then if you're dealing with things like the VA, right, and VA hospitals, which in general has been an unmitigated disaster for most veterans, because while those resources are there, they're extremely difficult to access, right? And so that can be a big issue with how veterans view the war, right? How they view their service, what they did and what they had to do, and how they endured. Um, and so you can have these outcomes that are both great, community building. You can find a lot of kinship within serving within the military and your unit, and create lifelong friendships and shared experiences. But at the same time, you're in a military fighting force, and not everything is going to be puppy dogs and rose petals, right? So there is going to be trauma involved, and there can be death or um, really serious injuries. So we would want to find out from veterans, like, how did you experience this? How do you feel about this? How do we look at the military ideology? When we think about America itself, how do we see our own military and it's being an aspect of um, sort of our imprint on the world, right? How do we relate to things like what's going on in um, the Ukraine, right? You've got this conflict going on, and uh, essentially we have been training the Ukrainians for over a decade on how to fight a war against Russia, and then supplying munitions and equipment and all of that stuff to aid in that fight without actually sending any individual soldiers into that fight. And if you think about it, it's kind of an interesting situation because you're not finding Americans, but American material, right? And material from around the world being donated to this fight um, against Russia. And it's not only an ideological war, right? A war of resources, a war of aggression, but it's sort of another sort of Cold War as well, about sharing resources and creating influence, and even things like uh, having the Ukraine join NATO, right, becomes a huge a hugely important thing to consider, because if they do, then that means other NATO states can then actively engage in warfare with Russia. And that's what Russia has been trying to get the Ukraine not to do, to agree with. And that's been part of the agreement for a long time, is that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. Uh, and that's monumentally huge to understand that particular point. When was the last time that the U.S. civilians experienced war? And I think this is a really important thing to consider, because our experience of war is oftentimes very different from people who actually experience war. We oftentimes experience war through our television sets, through video games, through the news, through maybe some interaction with veterans, and that kind of experience. But we don't usually see the results of war, and that's because war hasn't happened here really in a century, right? Where we've actually had civilians hurt from another country, another nation, our own buildings being burned or blown up. Our military has been able to force those kinds of conflicts away from our own shores, but that creates a different perspective, right? The average American citizen never experiences war. So that perception changes, right? And that perception is influenced by education, by entertainment, by religion, all of those things, but is never experienced firsthand. So that's something to consider, right? How are people going to react to a situation when they've never experienced the results of that? They don't have any personal experience with what it's like to be in a bombed out city, right? To see the devastation, to see people being dug out from buildings that have been hit by a missile, or some munition or something like that. You might see it on the TV, but there's no visceral sort of connection to it. You can just turn the TV off and turn on Wheel of Fortune, right? And go back to, living your daily life. So how do we expect behavior to develop and change if this is what's happening, if these are the things that people are seeing? And anthropology in general has been looking into sort of its relationship with the military. Back at the beginning of the war on terrorism, right after 9/11, there was a program that was developed called Human Terrain Teams. And this was an idea that the U.S. military first floated and then implemented by engaging cultural scientists, right, anthropologists, sociologists, and sending them out into the field with military units, right, Army, Marines, in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, in which they would be able to communicate with members of the communities that they were interacting with, find out and try and sort of do that whole win the hearts and minds of those communities. And it didn't work out quite as well, because of the fact that a lot of the information that was being sent back to the commanders within the military, they would learn things about who was living there, and then they would use that for strategic strikes, right? And anthropologists, we have typically the sort of same ideology of like do no harm. And the reason why they were there was to try and communicate and mitigate conflict. And then that wasn't sort of being respected. And so they bailed on the project, more or less. And this isn't the first time that this has happened. Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was Project Camelot, and Project Camelot was the CIA that uh, would go down into Central and South America, um, and take the work from anthropologists in the region that had been studying in these communities, and then use that information to do things like topple governments, to go after specific individuals that they didn't think were good people or whatever, and sometimes they weren't. Um, but all of a sudden, that information was being used, um, and harming people, and it was because of the research that the anthropologist had done. And so there's a very, very tricky relationship between the military and anthropology in general. Um, Not that that relationship hasn't been explored a number of times, but it's something to take into consideration and really pay close attention to. Okay, so the cost of war. So we do oftentimes find ourselves in um, tricky situations because one of the things we do travel a lot around the world, going to places that have experienced warfare, that are experiencing the cost of warfare, and they can find themselves in desperate situations. Um, but it's important to understand and go to those places so that we can experience and record what that is like to live in those places, to learn what that culture is going through, to respond, how they respond to warfare itself. Um, so there can be a lot of very good things that come out of it, but at the same time, um, because that information needs to get back to the general population that don't experience that war, right? Um, they also look at things that fuel wars, right? What is it that sparks a war to take place? Um, is it about resources? Is it about ideology? Is it about religion? Is it about um, any number of different things? What is it that's causing it? What is it perpetuating it? And then what ends it? Right? Those are all things that we can look into to try and understand how this happens. And then we also have to look at our own bias towards wars, right? How do we see war? What are the justifications for war? We grew up in this environment, and this environment has a specific way of dealing with things, and that's how we grew up. So when we, as researchers, go out there and look at the impacts of war, how does our own personal experience influence our decision making and our observations and things like that? So being really aware of our own bias and experience towards things like this becomes really important. Okay, so kind of going back to uh, World War II here for a second, and post World War II, we're going to look at this concept of like neoliberal economics, um, because this had a big impact on sort of political structures around the world, and we kind of talked a little bit about this. There was a big push for privatization, deregulation, and globalization, and this concept of free trade, right? In order to decrease government spending, um, and to privatize companies and venture capitalists, and increase private influence, right? So this was this shift from the government being in control of everything to creating smaller government, and then private companies picking up the slack, right, and having more and more of an influence. And this happened in a huge manner within the United States. We had big companies that were having a big impact on fighting wars, right? Again, looking back at sort of contractors and our relationship to contractors in the Middle East, um, and companies like Blackwater that have sent lots and lots of people over to fight those wars to sort of maintain those wars as they go forward, and then getting massive paychecks from it, right? And benefiting from it. These entities, the businesses and institutions began expanding beyond state borders, right? So expanding outside of their home nationality, and creating different markets and manufacturing outside, again, of their home nation. Um, and this isn't just war fighting, but this is also manufacturing, right? Um, Automobiles being one of those examples of how different companies have diversified where they're building and where they're sourcing their materials. Um, One of the interesting things about what's happening today is thinking about the sort of move towards electric vehicles, right? And so there's this big push right now to get electric vehicles. And one of those pushes is like that $7,500 um, tax incentive for buying an EV. But part of that incentive is that it has to be primarily made in the United States, right? So the majority of it has to be made here. But at the same time, there are um, uh, things to consider. A lot of the microchips that we use today in all of our electronics, our computers, our monitors, um, cameras, phones, most of those are made in places like Taiwan, right? Taiwan produces most of those microchips. Um, they build the vast majority of the of superconductors and um, of not superconductors. Yeah, again, like the microchips and stuff like that. Um, and so we have to source from them, right? China makes some and they're not great. The United States makes some and we're not producing enough. In fact, even and Biden was talking about creating microchip plants here in the United States so that we can build our own and we don't have to worry about sourcing from the outside. Um, but going back to the original subject, you have to be able to say that the majority of your vehicle is built here in the United States. And so that's a really interesting incentive going forward as far as thinking about manufacturing, right? And how are we going to be building vehicles and what kind of an influence that is going to have on future vehicles and consumerism. Um, and the interesting thing is that in this process, we have been creating new situations in different countries, right? So we've been able to fund different communities in again, like Mexico and Canada, in China, in Indonesia, in places around the world, Vietnam, Korea, um, in which they are creating a supply of resources that we are then consuming within the United States. And those companies oftentimes are dealing with um, different nations and different governments. And it's becoming more and more decentralized. And as a country might restrict sort of the capabilities of that company, maybe taxing more, then they will leave and find another place to manufacture and diversify. And so it has all of these different impacts within those countries that are being influenced either in a negative way by losing that work, or in a positive way by going someplace and creating labor. But at the same time, there can also be other things like environmental impacts, right? If you live in a country that has lacks environmental protection, right? But then you have a manufacturer come in and their manufacturing practices are dirty and more relaxed because their home country, like maybe the United States, says, well, you need to be, you have to follow these very specific rules. But if you go over here, you get cheap labor and you get to exploit the environment, right? Maybe that's a win-win for you as a corporation, but certainly not a win-win for the community that's being exploited. So, right, we can start to see that there are a number of issues. And then how do we organize that? If we are looking at this analytically, how do we think about government being in charge of many of these things, or do we want to see it privatized? How do we hold things accountable? All really interesting questions to try and understand why a culture makes these decisions, right? As individuals, right, we might have our opinions, but what is it that justifies this kind of behavior on a large scale? And how do we learn about that? How do we communicate to people and try and learn the whys? Part of this, we also have to start considering things about like labor and civil rights. Oftentimes, civil rights and labor movements begin with the exploitation of the community and the environment, right? So, labor's always been a concern, and as we've seen, again, as we talked about, sort of those unregulated areas being exploited, especially with countries that don't have that uh, that that control over the environment or don't care. Maybe they'd rather see the profits coming in and deal with the damage later. We start seeing sort of big issues, right? And then we start seeing things like NGOs being created to track, what's going on here. So these are non-governmental organizations, things like the United Nations and branches of the United Nations that track labor movement, labor in general, as far as the resources that they're given, sort of dealing with the environmental impacts and stuff like that. We also see other NGOs, either things like, in some cases, like banks that are going to have an impact. We also see things like charities, religious institutions, um, companies or institutions that are not profit motivated to go in and see what's going on within that community and track what's going on and why things are happening there. Excuse me. And so while we've been doing this, we've been tracking these companies and sort of controlling their behavior, whether or not it's good behavior, whether or not it's bad behavior. All of these things become important to pay attention to. So, right, and looking at sort of the ethical aspects of it. And different countries are going to have different responses about what is ethical. And so we can go in and track those things through different NGOs and different institutions. And so then we see sort of the mobilization of things like social justice, different institutions, different grassroots groups that are dealing with sort of these institutions that are exploitive, right? Even thinking about the auto workers' strikes or other unions that have been founded, unions themselves are oftentimes dealing with issues of labor and movement. In fact, it's because we have unions that we don't have child labor anymore. Because in the United States, it was totally legal to have child labor, right? Even to the point of like kids working in coal mines. That was not uncommon. If we go back 80 or 100 years, and it's because of unions that ended, those kinds of practices. Today, we see that kind of stuff as terrible, right? We don't want child labor. Children should be in school, learning and education, having a happy life, not getting black lung because at 8 years old they're in a mine digging. Um, that was a reality for us, right? So it isn't until we started seeing sort of the creation of these social movements to create better working conditions, uh, better labor practices. And so, where do we see those kinds of movements today? Right? Social justice, criminal justice, we see that a lot, especially with events like what happened to George Floyd, reproductive rights, um, the right to have an abortion. We see a lot of movement towards that, the right of bodily autonomy, Second Amendment, the right to own guns, the right to be protected from guns, and people who would do harm with that. And that's a real tricky one, right? Because there's a lot of different ideologies that fit into the Second Amendment, and it's usually a really big conflict, and it's worth talking about and understanding why so many people feel a certain way towards the use and ownership of firearms, right? We see it in immigration and migration practices, whether or not people from outside of the country should be let in. That's the discussion over the last few years of building a wall along the southern border. Um, who can be allowed into the country, right? The Muslim ban. Um, these are big issues to consider. Things like climate change and how climate change is impacting, even understanding the difference between climate and weather, right? I mean, I was just watching a segment from it was a discussion in Congress, and this congressman was talking about climate like it is actually just weather, right? Oh, we have seasons, and that's climate, and that's an incorrect way of looking at what climate actually is. Climate is our entire environment, and how it changes based on what's happening to our environment in general, whether or not it's warming, whether or not it's cooling, whether or not we've got, pollutants. And I think a lot of the stuff that when we think about climate change, in fact, I'll just make an admission here. I hate the term climate change. I think it's a terrible term because it has no gravity to it, right? When I say climate change, well, change happens, and climate, well, that sounds like weather. So, the weather's changing, that happens all the time. What we're really talking about is things like global pollution, right? And when we think about pollution and the impacts that it has, that might be a better term to use instead of a benign term like climate change. Anyway, off my soapbox. Things like LGBTQ plus communities, right? Gaining access and having um, rights over your spouse, whether or not they're LGBTQ, gaining access to medical resources, the ability to self identify, um, and to be recognized as a member of society without having you know the pressure of identity being pushed upon you. These are all huge things that's going on. And we see this mobilization that's taking place, and it's been taking place for decades. But how it gets implemented, right? We've seen this movement happening for a long time, but now it's finally grabbing hold, and we're seeing more things happen positively, but also resistance against. So, how do we deal with that? How do we look at that? Anti-war grassroots Um, if we look about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and the Palestinians, and what's happening with um, sort of these big, massive protests against Israel by the Jewish population, and sort of creating this conflict of conscience, um, and all kinds of things that are going on with this conflict, um, and understanding the difference between, again, nationality, religion, and individuality experience, right? And how all of those relate to each other. And if one is being impacted negatively, how are people going to respond, right? And a big part of that conflict is, does Israel represent the entire Jewish faith, and all of the Jews that are part of that religion? Um, and in many years, it kind of has, but we're seeing a huge pushback currently because there's a lot of people that disagree with what's going on in Israel right now. So, again, right, how do we look at those different things? And then where else, right? Where else do we find social movements, right? Uh, and how do we look at those? So we're do a quick exercise. I want you guys to think about things like the North Dakota pipeline and the death of George Floyd, right? How did these impact our society, and in what different ways? So, just for those of you who might not know about the North Dakota pipeline and the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, the idea is that you've got these pipelines that are owned by big oil companies that are running oil from places like Canada down to places to get refined, usually in the South, that can then be refined and then shipped to some other location. And in this case, this pipeline was being run through a part of the Standing Rock Reservation that had a lot of cultural significance, and there were burials, and there were all these things going on, and it's also reservation. They have their own rights in that community, and that community was being sort of, um, attacked by this company, and then by National Guard and Sheriff's Office and all of these different police forces. So there was this big thing going on. And then what was the result of it, right? What happened afterwards? How many people still talk about it? How many people still remember what happened and why it happened, and then is something else happening? And then we look at, say, like George Floyd, right? What happened with the fallout of George Floyd and his death, right? How much of an impact did that have on the country? And is continuing to have an effect in many places. And what is the perception of that? And what political side, excuse me, are experiencing the result of George Floyd, right? What are the conservative talking points? What are the liberal talking points? These things have had an impact on social change, but to what extent? So that's something we have to talk about. So I want you guys to think about this for a second, write something down, your own thoughts on this, and then contemplate sort of your ideas about what's happening. And if you don't know about either one of these things, read up on it, right? Find out what's going on and why. Okay, so we'll pause and then come back. Okay. So, in conclusion to all of this, we understand that that political systems have been created and organized in lots of different ways to suit the community, right? And their particular needs. Um, Bands as a political system and organization has dealt with, these ideas of egalitarianism, leadership through skill and knowledge, whoever is best fitted. Uh, Everyone contributes, everyone benefits. The redistribution of resources. We've looked at the tribal system and how they're made up of different bands and how they're connected to each other. And then that change from tribal to chiefdoms, and eventually city states as they sort of um, brought their resources together, introducing things like agriculture, were able to diversify and create specialty occupations, and what kind of an impact that'll have on a community. Um, and then how that sort of changed through um, sort of modern day business and the impact of um, the sharing of resources or creating of resources or the sort of neoliberal change in business and governance. We talked about how globalization has been impacting politics in different ways, certainly in like non-governmental organizations. Um, and then we also have like empire building, right? How different countries have impacted, but specifically the United States, and how it has changed its colonial practices into imperial practices, right? Creating a military empire around the world and owning different locations to have that global influence. And then how do we mobilize people? How do people react to what's going on around the world and how they're being impacted either environmentally, socially, religiously? And then what are their reactions? What do they expect to happen? How do they create change and implement that change, or how do they get resisted? Yeah. So, right, we have talked about a lot of different things when it comes to politics and the organization of the human species. So yeah, that's that's it. That's all she wrote. So if you've got any questions or concerns about this, or comments, please send them in. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next one. All right, take it easy.